So hello everyone, and today I'm welcoming Tony Liddicoat to talk about his experience with virtual exchange. He's also going to be a keynote speaker at our conference next year in Limassol, Cyprus. Tony, please introduce yourself to our viewers.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tony Liddicoat. I'm a professor in applied linguistics at the University of Warwick, and I've been working on issues around intercultural language teaching and learning for longer than I care to remember.
So you're not going to tell us then?
No, that'll be
Okay,
giving too much away.
okay. Now, as you say, your work focuses on intercultural learning, and can you tell us how virtual exchange is impacting that, according to what you've
Right. Well,
uncovered?
people have been talking about virtual exchange as a way of engaging with people from other cultures, speaking other languages for quite a long time now. But a lot of virtual exchange hasn't really had the intercultural as its focus. It's sometimes opportunities for language use or opportunities to have an experience of just communicating with somebody who is a first language speaker of a language you're learning, or it may be in a lingua franca context and so on. And for some people, the focus has been more on language use rather than intercultural learning. And the intercultural bits have been more in the background.
Mm.
But more recent work, well, actually work that's been going on for a long time, but is becoming stronger now, particularly since the pandemic, when virtual exchange became almost the only way of having exchange, is that people are now thinking about it much more in terms of the intercultural learning and how you can make that learning explicit.
Mm.
This is where my interest comes in, because I'm interested in the intercultural and language learning, and that's what I see as really core to knowing another language. Because the reason you learn another language is to talk to somebody in that language.
Well, it's
And
not just the language, it's a culture. The whole culture
yes,
is
yes.
coming to you,
So
isn't
the
it?
moment you use that language, you're involved in intercultural communication. And what we know about intercultural communication is that it's not difficulties of vocabulary and language that are often the big issues. It's just not knowing how to navigate cultural meanings and so on. So becoming more aware of that and how that impacts on communication, I think is really important.
Mm.
One of the things that's been really central in my own work is the idea that intercultural learning isn't learning about other people. It's actually learning about yourself in relation to other people.
Mm,
So
that's
the
interesting.
focus comes back to the learner and what the learner is doing in that moment of engagement with another language and culture.
Mm.
And then through a process of noticing what's going on, thinking about that in terms of your existing linguistic and cultural starting positions, reflecting on things, you come to understand your place in all of that. And it's only once you understand your place in all of that that you can understand the place of somebody else in all of that, because
Mm.
they're sort of the mirror image of what's going on for you. If you're having trouble with them, they're having trouble with you as well. And I think we've put too much emphasis on the other in this sort of learning. So, for example, when I was a French student back at high school, we were always learning about French people. Um, and the sort of French people I discovered when I went to France never existed anyway. But you learn about them as some sort of national, cultural, other, all French people are the same, and
Well,
so
it's
on.
a stereotypical
Yeah.
kind of vision of
Yeah.
people.
And when I first went to France as a teenager, I was really shocked by the fact that French people weren't actually like Australians who spoke French. They were uh, something entirely different and entirely radical that I hadn't been prepared for. And I can remember my very first full day in France. I needed to feed myself. I was an exchange student and all of those sorts of things. I needed to feed myself. So I went into a boulangerie and I wanted to buy a loaf of bread. And I suddenly, walking through the door, realized I had no idea how to ask for a loaf of bread in French. I could think of dozens of different ways to do it. I could even think of some that had a subjunctive in them that would have got me extra marks on the exam, but I didn't know what a French person would say.
Ah,
And so I suddenly realized that my knowledge of French, while it was pretty good, I was a PhD student in French at the time, uh, wasn't adequate for everyday interactions because I didn't know how to participate. Sure.
You talk about virtual exchange as an experience of linguistic and cultural diversity. Is this a branch of what you
This
mean
is
by
exactly
experience?
that. The moment you're engaged in virtual exchange or any other language use, you're engaged in linguistic and cultural diversity. You're engaged in intercultural communication. And what's going on in the background of any virtual exchange is this negotiation of meanings between you and your interlocutor, where you're trying to work out from your existing position what they're trying to tell you from their existing position, and then you're trying to help them to understand your version from their position. And so there's something really complex going on there. And that complexity needs to be brought much more to the surface so it'll become a learning experience.
Mm, mm, mm.
So
So your boulangerie experience became a learning experience. Are there any other examples, either on a personal level or that you've come across, that become learning, of other experiences that become learning? I mean, the
yeah,
shop one is fairly obvious and basic. Are there other
yeah.
more subtle levels of?
There are very subtle ones. I think sometimes my entire life is made up of these learning experiences. I mean, I grew up and worked for most of my life in Australia, but for the last 9 years, I've been here in the UK. And in my very first weeks here in the UK, I had an experience that was really an unpleasant experience, trying to speak English with the English, because frankly, from an Australian perspective, the English don't know how to speak English. And it all revolved around an expression that's used quite a lot in the area around Coventry, where my university is based, which is, "Are you all right?" And I was sitting in my office at work, and I work with my door open, so my colleagues were dropping by to introduce themselves and just to have a chat. And every uh, interaction began with, "Are you all right?" And I was thinking, oh, what nice people they are. I'm new here, and they're coming to sort of find out what's going on. And uh, yeah, so I thought they were nice, supportive colleagues. 2 weeks later, they were still doing exactly the same thing, and I started to get really annoyed because I didn't know what they were doing. I thought they thought I wasn't coping, and so I was having this tension every time I said hello to a colleague, which happens quite a lot in the course of one's day, and not just colleagues. It was happening all over the place, and this was what started me to recognize there was something going on that I needed to learn. And I remember one day, it was also in a shop. This time it was a butcher's shop. And I was in line for service, and the person behind the counter said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "No." And there's a look of absolute horror on this woman's face, like she didn't know what to do with that. And at that moment, it suddenly twigged for me that this was a moment I had to learn about. And what I subsequently realized is that if you say, "Are you all right?" in Australia, it implies you've got a problem. So I thought my colleagues were coming by saying, "Are you managing things? Are you dealing with things?" And my first days in the job, my first days in a new country, I thought this was really caring. But 2 weeks later, I think, they think I'm not coping. They think I'm not managing. Something's obviously going wrong that makes them think I'm not settling in or whatever. I thought things were going fine. And then it happened in this shop. And in the shop, it was intended as a greeting. But the same thing in an Australian context would have meant, "Are you being served?" And so I
Yeah.
heard, "Are you being served?" She heard, "How are you?" I said, "No, I'm not being served." And she said,
Or
heard
you're
this,
not
"I'm
all
not
right.
well." But of course, the thing you have to do in English if somebody says that is ask what's wrong. But that was totally inappropriate in a service encounter.
Oh,
And so what I really want to emphasize here is that anything can be that learning moment. And it can be very small, and it can be very trivial, and it can be very impactful. And it's got nothing to do with your language ability, because as a first language speaker of English, I like to think my English is pretty good,
yeah.
at least for that basic everyday interaction.
That's so interesting because I went to live in Australia some years ago, for a few years, and someone bought me a dictionary of Australian slang just so I would be prepared for the difference. And of course, it's not even a different language, as you say,
Yeah.
it's your language, but the meanings and the subtleties and the uses can be so different and
Yes.
have a profound impact on your
Yes.
day. And
Yeah,
very,
and on your relationships with
yes,
people, because if I hadn't sorted that out, it could have really had a negative impact on my working relationship with my colleagues. So, and they didn't know what was going on, and they didn't even necessarily know that I was having any difficulties because obviously I wasn't challenging them or anything like that. That's not the way you start in a new job. But I was having this very deep emotional experience.
yeah,
And sort of thinking back, apart from sort of the everyday practicalities of setting up bank accounts and all of that sort of thing, I think this is the biggest issue that I faced coming to live in the UK.
yes.
Uh, and it could have had a very profound impact, as I said, on relationship. Now, if you put that in the context of virtual exchange, the chances are somebody's going to say hello to somebody at some point, and there is this potential that these very simple sorts of things could lead to very profound consequences. And for
Yes,
me, that's what's interesting.
very interesting. And in fact, I wanted to bring it back to virtual exchange. And I know the Limassol UNICollaboration conference is in many months' time, but without giving too much away, are you going to touch upon some of these things? What are you going to talk about? You're one of the
Uh,
keynotes,
yeah.
so what can we
Actually, this
expect?
is
But don't
exactly
tell us
what I'm
too much.
this is exactly what I'm planning to talk about. I'm planning to talk about the idea that exchange is an engagement in linguistic and cultural diversity at every moment, and that teachers need to be aware of that and working with their learners about that. So prior to the exchange, there are things that you can do. Following the exchange, following each event in the exchange, there are things that you can do. So it's really about integrating the exchange in a program of intercultural learning rather than something sort of more simplistic where people get together and do cultural comparisons that sort of say the UK is like that and France is like that, and you come up with a bunch of stereotypes about each other, but rather what actually happened in that moment by moment interaction. How did you understand it? How did you deal with it? How did you feel about it? Because I think the emotional dimension can be quite important in all of this. The intercultural communication is profoundly emotional. It's not this cognitive thing, it's a thing you feel.
Mm.
And if those feelings don't get brought to the surface and explored and reflected on, they can sort of poison your relationship with people forever.
I just want to ask you one more thing before I
Sure.
let you go. In terms of virtual exchange and intercultural learning, are you seeing developments in the area? Are people beginning to take this aspect on more
Yes,
seriously?
most definitely. Uh, that people are starting to see virtual exchange not as the intercultural learning, but as the resource for intercultural learning. And I think that's a very important shift because intercultural learning doesn't happen simply because you've spoken to someone from another culture. It happens because you learn from the experience of speaking to somebody from another culture. And that's what we need to have very much at the forefront of these sorts of experiences to make them really valuable for student learning.
Oh, that's so interesting. I've really enjoyed our chat, Tony. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been nice to talk to you.